The wedding invitation had been mocking June Ellis from her refrigerator for 3 months. Now, standing in the corner of the reception hall, she wondered why she'd bothered coming at all. The DJ's questionable music taste filled the air with an odd mix of 80s ballads and current pop hits, while strings of warm lights cast a golden glow over tables of people who seemed to know exactly where they belonged. June didn't belong anywhere. Not really. At 29, she'd mastered the art of existing on the periphery, of being the person others relied on without actually letting them get close. It was easier that way. Safer. Her ash-blonde waves were pulled back in her signature messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She'd made an effort tonight, trading her usual scrubs for a simple navy dress that made her blue-gray eyes look stormy. "You must be from the bride's side," a woman in a sequined dress declared, settling into the empty chair beside June at the designated singles table. The woman's perfume was overwhelming, forcing June to resist the urge to roll up her sleeves, a nervous habit she'd never quite kicked. "Actually, no," June replied, taking a sip of her champagne. "I work with the groom at Chicago Memorial. I'm his charge nurse." She didn't add that she was here because Richard had seen her working through every holiday last year and had practically ordered her to come. "You need a life outside those hospital walls, Ellis," he'd said, his eyes kind but firm. The woman launched into a detailed analysis of the bride's dress, but June's attention drifted to the window behind them. Outside, Chicago's skyline glittered against the early evening sky, reminding her of all the nights she'd spent watching similar lights from the hospital's break room. There was something comforting about city lights. They never asked questions, never expected anything, never left. Her fingers absently traced the outline of the folded paper in her clutch, another unsent letter to her mother. June had started writing them at 16, right after her mom walked out, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note and a void that June had spent years trying not to fall into. The letters were her way of keeping control, of turning chaos into carefully chosen words that would never actually reach their intended recipient. "Is this seat taken?" The voice was quiet, almost lost in the DJ's transition to what sounded suspiciously like the Macarena. June looked up to find a man standing beside the empty chair to her right. He was tall, with the kind of presence that somehow managed to be both commanding and unassuming. His gray-blue eyes met hers with an uncertainty that felt startlingly familiar. "Only by people trying to escape the dance floor," June answered, surprising herself with the hint of humor in her voice. The man's mouth curved into a small smile as he sat down, and June noticed the way he immediately started turning a ring on his finger. Not a wedding band, she noted, but something older, more worn. "I'm Silas," he offered, his voice carrying that same quiet quality that seemed to create a bubble of calm around him. "June." She watched as he nodded, not rushing to fill the silence between them with the usual wedding small talk about how they knew the happy couple, or wasn't the ceremony just beautiful? Instead, he glanced at the dance floor and said, "I'm trying to decide if the DJ's music selection is ironically bad or just bad." A laugh escaped before June could catch it. "I'm going with bad, unless there's some hidden artistic merit to following Sweet Caroline with Baby Shark that I'm missing." His answering chuckle was warm, genuine. Maybe it's a commentary on the evolution of musical taste, or devolution, depending on how you look at it. June found herself relaxing just slightly as they fell into an easy conversation about terrible wedding songs and the strange social obligations that came with attending these events. Silas had a way of listening that made her feel heard rather than observed, and she caught herself sharing more than she usually would with a stranger. "So you're a nurse?" he asked, after they'd both declined invitations to join the conga line snaking through the reception hall. June nodded, automatically, straightening the silverware in front of her into perfect parallel lines. "Emergency department, night shift usually." "That must be intense," Silas remarked, and unlike most people who said those words, he didn't follow up with horror stories about their own emergency room visits or questions about the goriest things she'd seen. "It is," she agreed, then added, "but I like it. There's something Honest about emergency medicine. No pretense. No time for masks. People are just people at their most vulnerable and real. She caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You prefer things real," he said. It wasn't a question. "I prefer things true," June corrected, then wondered why she was being so candid with someone she'd never see again after tonight. Maybe it was the champagne, or the way his presence seemed to create a quiet space in the midst of the reception's chaos. Their conversation drifted to old movies. They both loved film noir, and then to coffee, when Silas admitted he'd never found a cup that quite matched his grandfather's brewing method. "The secret," June said, thinking of her grandmother Arden's kitchen on Sunday mornings, "is patience. Most people rush it." "Like most things worth having," Silas replied softly, and something in his tone made June look at him sharply. Their eyes met, and for a moment the wedding faded away. She saw in his face a reflection of her own carefully guarded loneliness, her own hesitation to reach for more than what was safe. The moment broke when the DJ announced the last dance. June glanced at her watch, surprised to find that hours had passed. Her shift started in 6 hours, and she still needed to check on her grandmother before heading to the hospital. "I should go," she said, gathering her clutch and shawl. "Early shift." The lie came easily. She'd learned long ago that "I need to leave" went down better with a practical excuse attached. Silas nodded, understanding in his eyes. He reached for a napkin from the table, pulling a pen from his jacket pocket. June watched as he wrote something, his handwriting neat but with a slight creative flair. "Here," he said, sliding the napkin toward her. "Because sometimes the truth deserves to be remembered." June picked up the napkin, reading the words he'd written. "If I had known you before, maybe I would have been braver." When she looked up, he was already walking away, his tall figure disappearing into the crowd of departing guests. June carefully folded the napkin and tucked it into her clutch, right next to her unsent letter. 2 pieces of truth, she thought, one spoken and one silent, both equally unlikely to change anything. Outside, Chicago's night air wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. June pulled her shawl closer, her fingers automatically rolling up the edges of her sleeves as she waited for her Uber. The city lights still glittered, constant and unchanging, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel like enough. She touched the napkin in her clutch one last time before getting into the car, allowing herself a moment to remember the way Silas had looked at her, like she was both a mystery he wanted to solve and a story he already knew by heart. "Where to?" the driver asked. "Chicago Memorial?" June replied, pushing thoughts of gray-blue eyes and honest silences aside. She had lives to save, routines to maintain, walls to keep up. One unusual evening couldn't change that, but as the car pulled away from the curb, June couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, some changes came disguised as endings, and maybe some brave thoughts, written on napkins by strangers who felt like old friends, had the power to crack foundations built on years of careful distance. She had no way of knowing that this was just the beginning, that fate had plans that would make her question everything she thought she knew about safety, trust, and the cost of keeping people at arm's length. For now, she was just June Ellis, heading back to her carefully ordered world, carrying a napkin with words that felt too much like hope. 3 days after the wedding, June's world refused to stay orderly. It started with a coffee stain on her favorite scrubs, continued with a missed train, and culminated in her regular coffee shop being mysteriously closed for renovations. Standing on the sidewalk in the crisp Illinois morning, she stared at the "under new management" sign as if it had personally betrayed her. "Just perfect," she muttered, adjusting her messy bun while checking the time on her phone. She had 40 minutes before her shift, and the nearest decent coffee shop was... She squinted at her map app, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled, slightly from caffeine withdrawal. The bell above the door chimed softly as June pushed into Ruby's coffee house, a place she'd passed 100 times but never entered. The aroma of freshly ground beans wrapped around her like a warm embrace, and for a moment, she was transported back to her grandmother's kitchen, where Arden would brew coffee with the patience of a saint, humming old jazz tunes while the morning light painted patterns on worn linoleum. "Welcome to Ruby's," a familiar voice said, and June's heart stumbled over its next beat. Silas stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a dark blue apron tied around his waist. His eyes widened slightly in recognition, and that same quiet smile from the wedding played at the corners of his mouth. "You," June managed, her brain scrambling to make sense of this coincidence. He looked different in daylight, more solid, more real. The careful distance of the wedding reception crumbled under the warm morning light streaming through Ruby's windows. "Me," he agreed, then added with a touch of humor, "though I usually go by Silas." June approached the counter, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. Up close, she noticed things she'd missed in the dim reception lighting, the slight scruff along his jaw, the way his gray-blue eyes had flecks of darker blue near the pupils, the small scar above his right eyebrow. "I didn't know you were a barista," she said, then immediately felt foolish. Of course she didn't know. They'd spent one evening talking about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding the personal details that might make their connection real. Something flickered across his face. Too quick to catch. "Before," he replied. "There's a lot we didn't cover between Sweet Caroline and Baby Shark." He reached for a cup, his father's ring catching the light. "What's your poison?" "Double shot Americano, extra hot," June answered automatically, then added, "My regular place is closed." "Ah, Palmer's." When she nodded, Silas's expression shifted slightly. "Yeah, they're undergoing some changes." June watched as he worked, his movements efficient but unhurried. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he approached each step of the brewing process, treating it with the same attention she gave to measuring medications or checking vital signs. "You know," he said, steam rising between them as he prepared her drink, "I kept thinking about what you said about patience. With coffee, I mean." June's fingers found the edge of her sleeve, rolling it slightly. "My grandmother's theory. She says most people try to rush the good things in life." "Smart woman." He paused, then asked, "Is she the one who raised you?" The question caught June off guard. She'd mentioned her grandmother only briefly at the wedding, but something in Silas's tone suggested he'd been paying more attention than she'd realized. "Yes," she answered carefully. "Arden, my grandmother, she took me in when I was 16. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Silas nodded, not pushing for more. Instead, he placed her coffee on the counter alongside a small paper bag she hadn't ordered. Before she could protest, he said, "House specialty, cranberry orange scone, because everyone needs a little sweetness with their bitter." June reached for her wallet, but Silas shook his head. "Consider it a thank you." "For what?" "For making bad wedding music bearable." A laugh escaped her, genuine, unguarded, and she saw something warm flash in his eyes. "Well, in that case, thank you for—" She paused, then finished softly, "being real." She took her coffee and the bag, turning to leave before the moment could become something more than she was ready for. But at the door, she glanced back. Silas was watching her, his expression thoughtful. "See you around, June," he said, and it sounded like both a promise and a question. The morning air hit her face as she stepped outside, and June took a sip of her coffee. It was perfect, rich, complex, with none of the burnt bitterness she'd grown accustomed to. Like its maker, it held depths she hadn't expected. Throughout her shift, June found herself thinking about coincidences, about how her regular coffee shop had closed right when she needed her caffeine fix, about how, of all the coffee shops in Chicago, she'd walked into his, about the way he'd remembered details from their conversation that she'd thought had been lost in the wedding's chaos. It wasn't until her break 14 hours later that June finally opened the paper bag. Inside, she found the scone and a napkin with familiar handwriting. Some coincidences are worth being brave for. She traced the words with her fingertip, remembering his first note from the wedding. 2 napkins now, both carrying words that felt like doors opening to rooms she'd kept locked for years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Arden. "Coming for Sunday breakfast? Those plants of mine are getting chatty without you." June smiled, thinking of her grandmother's small house with its overflow of potted plants, each one named and talked to, like a family member. Arden had always said that growing things needed patience and love in equal measure. "Just like people, Junebug," she'd say, using the childhood nickname that somehow never felt childish. "You can't rush a bloom any more than you can rush a heart to heal." Looking at Silas's note again, June wondered if maybe some coincidences weren't coincidences at all. Maybe they were more like seeds, planted in the right moment, waiting for someone brave enough to water them. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Palmer's Coffee Shop's website was open in her browser, the under new management notice prominently displayed. Something about the wording nagged at her, but before she could explore that thought, her pager went off. Multiple trauma incoming. June shoved the napkin into her pocket, where it settled next to the one from the wedding. In the emergency department's controlled chaos, she fell back into her routine, checking vitals, starting IVs, calling orders. But between the critical moments, her mind kept drifting to gray-blue eyes and the taste of perfectly brewed coffee. Later, as dawn broke over Chicago, June sat in the break room writing another letter she'd never send. But this time, instead of addressing it to her mother, she found herself writing about coincidences in coffee shops, about the weight of words written on napkins, and about the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, the scariest paths might lead to the safest places. She didn't sign the letter. Instead, she folded it carefully and slipped it between the pages of her notebook, right next to two napkins that smelled faintly of coffee and possibility. Outside her window, the city was waking up. Somewhere, in a coffee shop she'd never noticed, before yesterday, a man with quiet eyes and careful hands was probably brewing coffee with the patience her grandmother had always preached about. June touched the napkin in her pocket and allowed herself just for a moment to wonder what other coincidences might be waiting around the next corner. Sunday mornings at Arden Ellis's house followed their own rhythm. June pulled into the familiar driveway, noting how the morning glory vines had nearly overtaken the mailbox. The modest two-story house looked exactly as it had when she'd first arrived here at 16. A little worn around the edges, but sturdy, dependable, like the woman who lived inside. "There's my Junebug," Arden called from the porch where she sat surrounded by potted plants. At 76, she moved more slowly than she used to, but her dark eyes still sparkled with the same mischief that had helped June through her darkest days. Today she wore one of her signature floral dresses, its bright colors contrasting beautifully with her deep brown skin. "Morning, Gran," June said, climbing the steps to kiss her grandmother's cheek. "How's Gerald doing?" She nodded toward the struggling fern Arden had named after her late husband. "Oh, he's just being stubborn like his namesake." Arden patted the plant's leaves affectionately. "Nothing a little extra love won't fix." She fixed June with a knowing look. "Speaking of which, you're glowing this morning. And don't tell me, it's just the sunshine." June felt heat creep into her cheeks. "It's nothing," she said, following her grandmother into the house. The familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon rolls wrapped around her like a hug. "Mm-hmm," Arden hummed, unconvinced. "That's why you've been smiling at your phone for the past week, nothing?" "I haven't been—" June started to protest, then caught herself as her phone buzzed in her pocket. She'd been exchanging texts with Silas since their meeting at Ruby's. Nothing serious, just observations about coffee, old movies, and the questionable music choices of Chicago's radio stations. But each message felt like a small truth shared between them. Arden's kitchen was a time capsule of memories. The worn Formica table where June had done her homework, the windowsill lined with herb plants, all named after jazz musicians, the old radio that only played AM stations. June settled into her usual chair while her grandmother poured coffee into their mismatched mugs. "You know," Arden said casually, setting June's coffee down. "Miles Davis here." She gestured to the basil plant. "Thinks you met someone." June wrapped her hands around the warm mug, inhaling the rich aroma. Miles Davis should mind his own business. He's very observant for a basil plant. Arden's eyes twinkled. Almost as observant as a grandmother who hasn't seen you check your phone this much since, well, ever. Before June could respond, her phone buzzed again. Despite herself, she glanced at the screen. Found an old noir film playing at the Biograph. Tonight. Interested in testing my movie trivia knowledge? June's heart did a small flip. She'd mentioned her love of classic films during their first meeting, but she hadn't expected him to remember, let alone act on it. Ah, Arden said softly. There's that smile again. It's just... June hesitated, then admitted, I met someone. At Richard's wedding. But it's complicated. Love usually is, baby. Arden reached across the table to squeeze June's hand. That's what makes it worth it. I didn't say anything about love, June protested, but even as she said it, she thought about the way Silas looked at her, like he saw past all her carefully constructed walls. You didn't have to. Arden stood slowly, making her way to the kitchen counter where cinnamon rolls waited. Now, tell me about this complicated someone while we have breakfast. June found herself talking about Silas, about their meeting at the wedding, their unexpected reunion at Ruby's, the way he wrote thoughts on napkins like they were precious things to be preserved. She didn't mention how each text message felt like a small act of trust, or how she'd caught herself driving past Ruby's on days she didn't even need coffee. He's different, she finished lamely, not knowing how else to explain it. Arden listened, with the patience of someone who had weathered many storms and still believed in rainbows. Different how? He's... June searched for the right words. Real, present, but also, there's something he's not telling me. I can feel it. Everyone has their stories, Junebug. Arden's voice was gentle. You, of all people, should know that. Remember how long it took you to tell me about those letters you write to your mother? June's fingers automatically went to her sleeve, rolling the edge. That's different. Is it? Arden stood again, this time moving to the window where her plants basked in the morning light. You know, when I first got Gerald, the original Gerald, mind you, not this dramatic fern, he didn't tell me he was sick. Kept it to himself for months. By the time I figured it out, she trailed off, touching a leaf tenderly. But you know what? Those months we had, they were beautiful. And if I'd known from the start how it would end, I'd still choose him. Every time. June watched her grandmother, seeing the grief and love that still lingered after all these years. But what if? No what ifs, Arden interrupted firmly. Life's too short for what ifs. Now, are you going to answer that boy about the movie, or should I tell Miles Davis he was wrong about you being interested? June looked down at her phone, where Silas's message still waited for a response. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. What if he's not who I think he is? She whispered, voicing her deepest fear. What if he's exactly who you need him to be? Arden countered. Sometimes, Junebug, the bravest thing we can do is let someone surprise us. June's phone buzzed again. No pressure. But they're showing The Big Sleep, and I remember someone saying it was their favorite. He'd remembered. Of course he had. Just like he remembered how she took her coffee, the story about her first night shift, the way she'd described Chicago's lights at 3 a.m. Okay, June typed back, her heart racing. But I warn you, my Bogart trivia is unbeatable. His response was immediate. I'm counting on it. Looking up, she found Arden watching her with a soft smile. There's coffee in my cupboard that's been waiting years to be brewed, her grandmother said. Don't let fear make you wait too long for the good things, baby. June nodded, thinking of napkin notes and careful smiles, of coincidences that felt like destiny, and secrets that felt like walls waiting to crumble. She thought about how Silas never pushed, never rushed, how he seemed to understand her need for space even as he slowly filled it with his presence. Later that evening, as she got ready for the movie, June found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She left her hair down, the ash blonde waves falling past her shoulders. In her mirror, she saw a reflection of someone willing to try, someone brave enough to let the walls crack just a little. Her phone buzzed one more time. By the way, I made coffee for the movie, because some things are better shared. June smiled, thinking of her grandmother's words about patience and timing, about love and courage, about letting someone surprise you. She grabbed her jacket and headed out, carrying with her Arden's wisdom and the hope that maybe, just maybe, some complicated things were worth figuring out. The evening air was cool against her face as she drove toward the Biograph Theater, its vintage marquee a beacon in the growing darkness. She didn't know what stories Silas was keeping, what truths lay behind his quiet smiles and careful words. But for the first time in years, she wanted to find out. Because sometimes, the scariest steps lead to the most beautiful destinations. And sometimes a cup of coffee shared in the dark of an old movie theater could be the beginning of something worth being brave for. The Biograph Theater stood like a ghost from another era, its red marquee lights casting warm shadows across the sidewalk. June sat in her parked car, watching people filter into the historic building. Her fingers drummed against the steering wheel as she debated, for the 100th time, whether this was a mistake. Her phone lit up. I'm by the poster of Bogart, though I have to say, he's giving me judgmental looks for bringing coffee into his territory. A smile tugged at her lips despite her nerves. June checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, her loose waves framing her face, the simple black sweater making her blue-gray eyes look deeper somehow. Different from the practical nurse she saw every day, but still unmistakably her. The lobby of the Biograph smelled of popcorn and history. Silas stood exactly where he'd said he would, 2 coffee cups in hand, looking casually elegant in dark, jeans and a charcoal button-down. When he spotted her, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. You came, he said softly, as if he'd been half expecting her to change her mind. Couldn't let you get away with thinking you know more about film noir than me, June replied, accepting the coffee he offered. Their fingers brushed, and she felt that same electric current that had been there since the wedding. I wouldn't dare, Silas chuckled, then gestured to her hair. You look different. Good different. June took a sip of coffee to hide her blush. It was perfect, of course. He'd remembered exactly how she liked it. Good different works for me. They found seats in the back of the theater, away from the small Sunday night crowd. The vintage ceiling tiles above them told stories of decades, of film lovers who'd sat in these same seats sharing moments in the dark. So, June said as they settled in, ready to test your Bogart knowledge? Silas turned toward her, his gray-blue eyes catching the dim light. Did you know Bogart was actually afraid of horses? They had to use tricks to film his riding scenes, in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Amateur fact, June countered with a grin. Try this. In The Big Sleep, the screenwriters contacted Raymond Chandler to ask who killed the chauffeur, and he admitted he had no idea. Their trivia battle continued through the pre-show, each fact revealing layers of shared passion. June found herself relaxing into the easy rhythm of their conversation. The way Silas listened like every word mattered, how his laugh seemed to warm the space between them. As the lights dimmed and the film began to roll, June became aware of every point where their bodies almost touched, their elbows on the shared armrest, the slight brush of their shoulders when either of them moved. The familiar story played out on screen, but she found herself equally captivated by the man beside her, by the way he mouthed certain lines along with Bogart, by how he seemed to anticipate the moments that would make her smile. Halfway through the film, Silas leaned closer to whisper a comment about the cinematography. His breath tickled her ear, and June felt goosebumps rise along her arms. She turned to respond and found his face inches from hers, his eyes reflecting the silvery light from the screen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world narrowed to the space between their breaths, to the way his gaze dropped to her lips before meeting her eyes again. June felt herself leaning in slightly, drawn by something stronger than gravity. A sudden burst of gunfire from the movie made them both jump, breaking the spell. June let out a shaky breath, her heart racing as she tried to focus back on the screen. But she could feel Silas's presence more acutely than ever, like a current of electricity running through the darkness. When the film ended and the lights came up, they lingered in their seats, neither quite ready to break the bubble of intimacy the theater had created. "Coffee?" Silas suggested, even though it was nearly midnight. "I know a place." June smiled, remembering their first real conversation. "Let me guess, you know the owner?" Something flickered in his eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Something like that," he said, his hand moving to turn the ring on his finger. They walked the few blocks to a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a vintage record shop. The sign above the door read, "Night Owl Coffee Co." And through the window, June could see comfortable chairs and warm lighting. "It's beautiful," she said as they stepped inside. The walls were lined with old movie posters and the rich aroma of coffee filled the air. "It's one of my favorites," Silas replied, but there was something careful in his tone that made June look at him more closely. He moved through the space with familiar ease, greeting the barista by name, knowing exactly where everything was. As they settled into a corner table with their drinks, June noticed more details. The way the staff kept glancing at their table, how the manager seemed to hover nearby, the subtle nod Silas gave him that sent him hurrying away. "Silas," she said slowly, "how do you know this place so well?" He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw a real conflict there. "June, The manager's phone rang, cutting through the quiet atmosphere. "Mr. Ward," he called out. "The Chicago Heights location is on the line. They need your approval for—" He stopped abruptly, seeing Silas's expression. June felt the world tilt slightly. Ward. The name tickled something in her memory. A news article. She'd scrolled past. A business section headline she'd barely registered. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving before she could stop them. One quick search was all it took. Silas Ward, owner of Ward Coffee Enterprise, the company that had just bought out Palmer's and a dozen other local coffee shops across Illinois. The under new management sign suddenly made sense. "June." Silas's voice was soft, pleading. "Let me explain." She looked at him, really looked at him now. The carefully casual clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The way he carried himself, not just quiet but practiced. The ring on his finger that wasn't just any family heirloom but likely worth more than her car. "You let me think you were a barista," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the roaring in her ears. "I never actually said—" "No." June cut him off, standing up. "You just let me assume because that was easier, right? More authentic?" The last word tasted bitter on her tongue. It wasn't like that. Silas stood too, reaching for her hand, but June stepped back. Then what was it like? She could feel her walls slamming back into place brick by careful brick. Was I just an interesting experiment? The nurse who likes her coffee extra hot and her movies in black and white? God, no, June, please. But she was already moving toward the door, her boots clicking against the hardwood floors that suddenly seemed too polished, too perfect. Outside, the night air hit her face like a slap. June walked quickly, not sure where she was going, but needing to move. Behind her, she heard the door open, heard Silas call her name. She kept walking. Past the biograph where just hours ago, she'd felt something real growing between them. Past storefronts that might or might not belong to his empire. Past all the moments they'd shared that now felt scripted, edited, produced for someone else's viewing pleasure. Her phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. She didn't look at it. Instead, she did what she'd learned to do at 16 when her mother left. She focused on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting somewhere safe where she could sort through the wreckage of her own expectations. It wasn't until she was in her car that June realized she was still holding the coffee cup he'd bought her. With trembling hands, she set it in the cup holder, trying not to think about how perfectly he'd learned to make her coffee, how that might have been the only genuine thing between them. As she drove home through Chicago's glittering streets, June thought about her grandmother's words about letting people surprise you. She'd been surprised all right. And as the city lights blurred through her tears, she wondered if some surprises weren't worth the cost of admission. The emergency department at Chicago Memorial never slept, but tonight its chaos felt different to June. 3 days had passed since the movie theater, since the moment truth had shattered whatever was growing between her and Silas. She moved through her shift like a ghost, checking vitals, dispensing medications, speaking softly to worried families, all while trying to ignore the 17 unread messages on her phone. "Ellis," Dr. Chen's voice cut through her thoughts. "We need you in trauma too." June snapped back to professional mode, following the attending physician into the trauma bay where a young woman lay unconscious, her face pale against the starched hospital sheets. "Drug overdose," Chen reported briskly. "Found unresponsive, in her car outside some coffee shop downtown." June's hands moved automatically, starting the IV line while Chen rattled off orders. The patient couldn't have been more than 25. Blonde hair matted with sweat, designer clothes that probably cost more than June made in a month. A small notepad had fallen from her purse, its pages filled with what looked like interview questions. "Found her press badge," a nurse said, holding up an ID card. "She's a reporter for the Chicago Tribune." Something cold settled in June's stomach. She glanced at the notepad again, catching fragments of hastily scribbled notes. Ward Coffee Enterprise. Expansion plans, background on CEO. The monitor beeped steadily as they worked, pushing medications, checking responses. June forced herself to focus on the immediate needs. This woman's life was more important than whatever story she'd been chasing. More important than the way June's heart clenched at seeing Silas's company name scrawled in that notebook. Hours later, when the reporter was stable and transferred to ICU, June found herself in the break room, staring at her phone. The unread messages glowed accusingly. "Please let me explain. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant to hurt you. June, please." She scrolled past them all, opening her browser instead. The Chicago Tribune's website loaded, and there it was, a feature article from 6 months ago. Ward Coffee Enterprise, the silent giant changing Chicago's coffee culture. The photo showed Silas in a tailored suit, looking nothing like the man who'd sat beside her in a dark theater. Quoting Bogart. The article detailed his rise in the business world, his reputation for staying out of the spotlight, his recent string of acquisitions including several beloved local coffee shops. Despite his success, the article read, Ward remains notoriously private, refusing most interviews and avoiding public appearances. Sources close to the businessman suggest this stems from a highly publicized broken engagement 3 years ago, when social media influencer Regina Blake ended their relationship, citing Ward's pathological need for privacy as the main reason. June's finger hovered over the back button, but she kept reading, each word another brick in the wall between them. Ward's purchase of Palmer's coffee shop marks his company's 15th acquisition this year, leading to concerns about the corporatization of Chicago's independent coffee scene. When asked about these concerns, Ward's only comment was, "Some things are worth preserving even if the method of preservation isn't what people expect." A knock at the break room door made her jump. Nurse manager Davis stood there, concern etched on her face. "June? Your grandmother's on the phone, says she can't reach your cell." June's heart stopped. Arden never called the hospital unless... She rushed to the nurse's station, grabbing the phone. "Gran? What's wrong?" "Nothing serious, baby." Arden's voice was slightly breathless but steady. "Just a little dizzy spell. But you know how Dr. Matthews has insisted I call someone." "I'm coming over," June said immediately, already reaching for her bag. "Let me just tell Davis." "Junebug, I'm fine. Really. Besides, isn't this your double shift? I'll find coverage." June was already scanning the schedule board. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The drive to Arden's house was a blur of worry and guilt. She should have checked on her grandmother sooner, should have noticed if something was wrong. But she'd been so wrapped up in her own drama, in avoiding calls and messages, in pretending her heart wasn't breaking over someone she barely knew. Arden was in her usual chair on the porch, surrounded by her beloved plants when June pulled up. She looked tired but alert, a knowing smile crossing her face as June rushed up the steps. "I knew that would get you here," she said, accepting June's fierce hug. "Gran!" June pulled back, scandalized. "Did you fake being sick?" "Oh, I had a real dizzy spell." Arden waved off her concern. "But I'm fine now. Mostly I was worried about you. You haven't been answering your phone, and Miles Davis here was getting anxious." June sank onto the porch step, letting her head rest against her grandmother's knee like she used to do as a teenager. "He found out about Silas. The basil plant has its sources." Arden's fingers gently stroked June's hair. "Want to tell me what happened?" So June did. She told her grandmother everything. About the movie, the almost kiss, the coffee shop revelation. About how Silas had hidden his true identity. About the article she'd just read. About the reporter in her ER who'd been investigating him. "And now," June finished, her voice thick, "I don't know what was real and what wasn't." Arden was quiet for a long moment, her hand still moving soothingly through June's hair. Finally, she said, "You know, when your grandfather first asked me out, he told me he was a jazz musician." June sat up, surprised. "But Grandpa Gerald was a high school music teacher." Arden's eyes twinkled. "He said he was too nervous to tell me the truth right away. Thought I wouldn't be impressed by a teacher. Took him 3 dates to come clean." "That's different," June protested. "He wasn't what? Scared? Unsure? Looking for someone to see him for who he was, instead of what he did?" Arden's voice was gentle but firm. "Baby, everyone has their reasons for the walls they build. The question is whether what's behind those walls is worth climbing over them for." June thought about Silas's quiet way of listening, how he remembered every detail she shared, how his eyes lit up when she laughed. She thought about the napkin notes, each one a small truth offered without demand. "But he lied," she whispered. "Did he?" Arden challenged. "Or did he just let you see the part of himself he wishes he could be all the time?" Before June could respond, her phone buzzed with a new message. Not from Silas this time, but from an unknown number. "Ms. Ellis, this is Regina Blake. We need to talk about Silas Ward. There are things you should know." June stared at the message, feeling the weight of choices pressing down on her. Behind, her Arden's wind chimes tinkled softly in the evening breeze, a counterpoint to the chaos in her mind. "Sometimes," Arden said softly, as if reading her thoughts, "the hardest part isn't forgiving someone else's secrets. It's forgiving ourselves for wanting to know the truth even when it hurts." June looked up at her grandmother, seeing the wisdom in those dark eyes that had guided her through so many storms. "What do I do, Gran?" "What you always do, Junebug. You help people heal." Arden squeezed her hand. "The question is, whose healing matters more right now? Yours or his?" The phone felt heavy in June's hand as another message from Regina Blake appeared. Outside, Chicago's evening sky painted itself in shades of possibility and doubt, while somewhere in the city, a man who wrote his heart on coffee shop napkins was probably turning his father's ring, waiting for an answer that June wasn't sure she was ready to give. The Lux Hotel's rooftop restaurant seemed designed to make people like June feel out of place. Crystal chandeliers caught the midday sun, casting rainbow prisms across white tablecloths, while Chicago's skyline provided a backdrop worthy of a magazine spread. June smoothed her simple black dress, the one she kept for patient family meetings, and wished she'd worn something else, anything else. Regina Blake didn't just enter the restaurant, she commanded it. Tall, willowy, with the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged on Instagram feeds, she moved through the space like she owned it. Her designer dress probably cost more than June's monthly rent, and her perfectly styled auburn hair didn't dare move in the rooftop breeze. "June Ellis?" Regina's smile was practiced, professional. "Thank you for meeting me." June nodded, watching as Regina settled into the chair across from her with practiced grace. A waiter materialized instantly, as if summoned by some secret signal. "Sparkling water with lime," Regina ordered, then glanced at June. And for you? Just water, June said, then added, regular water. Regina's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. Not a fan of bubbles? Not a fan of pretense, June replied evenly. Something like respect flickered in Regina's green eyes. Direct. I can see why he likes you. She opened her designer handbag, pulling out a slim tablet. Though I have to wonder if you really know who you're dealing with. If you're here to warn me about Silas, I'm here, Regina interrupted smoothly, to tell you the truth. Whether it's a warning or not depends on your perspective. She tapped the tablet's screen, turning it toward June. Have you seen these? June looked at the collection of news articles displayed. Ward Coffee Enterprise expands. Local shops fear corporate takeover. Silent giant, the man behind Chicago's coffee revolution. Reclusive CEO continues buying spree. I've read about his business, June said carefully. Regina's laugh was musical but sharp. His business? Honey, his business is the least interesting thing about Silas Ward. She swiped to a different screen, this one showing photos of a younger Silas at various social events. 3 years ago, he was different, public, present, the kind of CEO who showed up at charity galas and gave interviews about sustainable coffee farming. June couldn't help but study the photos. Silas looked polished, camera-ready, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. His father's ring was there, catching the camera flashes. What changed? June asked, even though part of her didn't want to know. Regina sat back, something complicated crossing her face. I did. Or rather, what I did. She took a careful sip of her water. You see, Silas Ward has a particular talent for seeing the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. The waiter returned with their drinks. June wrapped her fingers around her plain water glass, needing something solid to hold on to. We were engaged, Regina continued once they were alone again. The perfect power couple, the social media influencer and the coffee king. I had 2 million followers who hung on every detail of our relationship. But Silas, he kept trying to keep parts of our life private. He'd get uncomfortable when I'd post about our intimate moments or share details about his family, maybe because those things were personal, June said quietly. Regina's smile turned bitter. That's what he said. But in today's world, personal is profitable. So I started sharing more. Pictures he didn't know I'd taken. Conversations he thought were private. My following doubled. Companies were throwing sponsorship deals at me. She paused, touching her own water glass. Then his father died. June felt something cold settle in her stomach. She remembered the ring Silas constantly turned on his finger. Silas was devastated, Regina continued. He withdrew from everything, spent days just sitting in his father's old study. I thought if I could just show people this human side of him, they'd connect with our story even more. So I posted pictures of him grieving, private moments he never wanted shared. You didn't, June whispered. But she could see it in Regina's face. She had. The post went viral. My engagement numbers were through the roof, but Silas... Regina's perfect composure cracked slightly. He just looked at me and said, some things aren't for sale. Then he walked away. From me, from the public eye, from everything we'd built. She closed the tablet with a decisive click. Within a month, he'd bought out 3 local coffee shops and started building his empire, but he did it quietly, hidden behind corporate paperwork and NDAs. June thought about Silas at Ruby's, making coffee with careful attention, about the way he seemed most himself in quiet moments, away from curious eyes. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Regina leaned forward, her expression suddenly intense. Because you need to understand, Silas Ward isn't just a man who owns coffee shops. He's a man who's learned that truth is dangerous, that love comes with cameras, that trust is just another word for leverage. She pulled out her phone, showing June a social media post. This went up 10 minutes ago. The post showed a grainy photo of June and Silas at the Biograph Theater, his face turned toward her with unmistakable tenderness. The caption read, "Chicago's Coffee King spotted with mystery woman. Is Chicago Memorial's night nurse the one to thaw his frozen heart?" June felt sick. "How did you—" "I didn't," Regina cut her off. "But someone did. And trust me, they'll find out everything. Your mother leaving when you were 16. The letters you never send. The way you organize things by color when you're stressed. In this world, privacy is an illusion." "Stop." June stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get to use my life as a warning." Regina's expression softened slightly. "I'm not trying to hurt you, June. I'm trying to prepare you. Silas lives in a world where everything is potential content, where every moment can be monetized. He tried to protect you from that by keeping his identity secret. But secrets have a way of coming out." June grabbed her purse, needing to escape the crystalline perfection of the rooftop, the weight of Regina's revelations, the way Chicago's skyline suddenly seemed too exposed. "June," Regina called as she turned to leave. "He'll try to fix this, to protect you, but ask yourself, do you really want to live your life hiding from cameras, looking over your shoulder, wondering if every quiet moment will end up as someone else's content?" In the elevator, June's phone buzzed with a text from Silas. "I just saw the post, June. I'm so sorry. Please let me explain." Another buzz, this time from an unknown number. "Hi, reporter from Chicago Life here. Would love to chat about your relationship with Silas Ward." By the time she reached the lobby, there were 3 more messages from different reporters. June pushed through the revolving doors into the afternoon sun, feeling exposed in a way she never had before. A nearby teenager raised their phone, probably just taking a selfie, but June flinched anyway. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her grandmother. "Come home, June Bug. The plants and I have something to tell you." June's hands shook as she ordered a rideshare. As she waited, she thought about Silas turning his father's ring, about the way he wrote his thoughts on napkins instead of social media posts, about how he looked most real in the quiet darkness of an old movie theater. She thought about Regina's words, "Privacy is an illusion." But then she thought about Arden's voice. "Sometimes the hardest walls to climb are the ones we build ourselves." The rideshare pulled up and June slid into the back seat, giving her grandmother's address. As Chicago flowed past the windows, she pulled out her phone one last time, looking at the photo of her and Silas at the theater. In it, they existed in their own world, unaware of cameras or consequences. She wondered if any moment could ever be that pure again. Behind her, the Lux Hotel rose into the afternoon sky, its windows reflecting a city that never stopped watching, never stopped sharing, never stopped turning private moments into public currency. Somewhere in that city, a man who valued privacy above profit was probably trying to protect her from a world he'd been running from for years. June closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the cool window. She had decisions to make, walls to climb or reinforce. But first she needed her grandmother's wisdom, her plant's silent counsel, and maybe, just maybe, a cup of coffee brewed with the patience Arden had always preached about. When June arrived at her grandmother's house, something was different. The porch, usually alive with Arden's chatter to her plants, was quiet. Inside, she found her grandmother in the kitchen, not in her usual chair, but standing at the counter, methodically sorting through what looked like old photographs. "Gran?" June called softly, noting how Arden's floral dress seemed to hang a bit looser than before. "Perfect timing, Junebug." Arden didn't turn around. "Put the kettle on, would you? We're having tea today, not coffee." The switch from their usual coffee ritual sent a small shock through June's system. In 13 years, they'd never had a serious conversation over tea. Coffee was for everyday truths. Tea was for the heavy ones. As June filled the kettle, she noticed more details. The slight tremor in Arden's hands as she handled the photos, the unopened mail on the counter, the way the kitchen plants looked slightly underwatered. "I saw the photo," Arden said finally, still facing the counter. "The one of you and Silas at the theater." "Gran, But that's not what we need to talk about first." Arden turned, and June's heart stopped. In her hands was a familiar envelope, one of June's unsent letters to her mother dated just last week. How did you? Found it when I was changing Gerald's soil. Arden's dark eyes were gentle but serious. It fell out of your bag. I didn't mean to read it, but... She settled into her chair at the table, placing the letter carefully between them. Sit down, baby. It's time we talked about some things. The kettle whistled, its cry piercing the kitchen's tension. June moved automatically, preparing 2 cups of the chamomile tea her grandmother kept for special occasions. Her hands shook slightly as she set them on the table. You're sick, June said, the words falling like stones into the quiet kitchen. It wasn't a question. Arden nodded slowly. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 2 months ago. The world tilted on its axis. June gripped the edge of the table, feeling like she was 16 again, reading another life-changing note in this same kitchen. 2 months? Why didn't you tell me? Because you needed to live your life, Junebug, not spend every moment worrying about mine. Arden reached across the table, covering June's hand with her own. And because I needed to see something first. See what? See you open your heart again. Arden squeezed her hand. That letter you wrote, it wasn't just to your mother this time, was it? June closed her eyes, remembering the words she'd poured onto paper after fleeing the Lux Hotel. Dear Mom, I think I understand now. Why running felt easier than staying. There's a man who sees me, really sees me, and it terrifies me. He hid things too, just like you did. And now I'm sitting here writing another letter I'll never send, wondering if I learned how to run from you, or if it's just in our blood. Oh, baby. Arden's voice was soft. When are you going to stop punishing yourself for other people's choices? I'm not, June started, but Arden cut her off. You are. Every time you walk away first. Every time you choose safety over possibility. Every time you write these letters instead of living your life. You're letting your mother's choice define you. June stared at her tea, watching the steam rise, in delicate spirals. It's not that simple anymore. There are reporters, Gran. Social media. Everyone wants to know about the mystery woman who caught Silas Ward's attention. And I'm not built for that world. I'm not Regina Blake with her perfect hair and designer dresses. I'm just me. A night shift nurse who writes letters to ghosts and organizes things by color when she's scared. Arden's laugh was unexpected and bright. Baby, that's exactly why he fell for you. Because you're real in a world that's forgotten how to be. June looked up, seeing the fierce love in her grandmother's eyes. But what if? No more what ifs. Arden's voice was firm. I don't have time for them anymore, and neither do you. She pushed back from the table, moving to the window where her beloved plants soaked in the afternoon light. You know why? I name all my plants? The sudden change in topic threw June. Because you like giving everything a story? Because names make things real. Make them matter. Arden touched a leaf tenderly. When you name something, you can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore, can't hide from it. She turned back to June. So name it, baby. Name what you're really afraid of. June felt tears burning behind her eyes. Losing control, she whispered. Being left again. Loving someone who might disappear. Like your mother did. Arden nodded. Like I'm going to. Gran, don't. It's true, Junebug. I'm going to leave you, not by choice like your mother did, but because that's how life works. Arden moved back to the table, her steps slower than usual, but her spine straight. But here's what you need to understand. Love isn't about controlling who stays and who goes. It's about being brave enough to let people in, even knowing they might leave. June's tears fell freely now. I don't know how to be that brave. Yes, you do. Arden pulled another photo from her pile, sliding it across the table. Look. It was a photo June had never seen before. Herself at 16, curled up in this very kitchen, reading a book while Arden cooked. But what caught her eye was her expression. Peaceful, present, healing. That was taken 2 weeks after your mother left, Arden said softly. When you were at your most broken. But look at you. Still able to lose yourself in a story. Still able to find moments of peace. That's bravery, baby. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to live anyway. June traced the edge of the photo, remembering that girl who'd learned to trust again, one cup of coffee at a time. Silas tried to call, after the photo leaked. And? I didn't answer. I was too scared of what else might come out, what other parts of my life might become public property. Arden reached for June's tea, reheating it with the practiced motion of someone who'd spent years making cold drinks warm again. You know what I think? I think you're not really afraid of the public knowing your story. You're afraid of letting yourself have one worth telling. The words hit June like a physical force. She thought about Silas writing his thoughts on napkins, turning his father's ring, trying to find authenticity in a world that preferred performance. She thought about Regina Blake's warning about privacy being an illusion, and wondered if maybe the real illusion was thinking you could live a life without risk. Her phone buzzed, another reporter probably, but under that notification was Silas's last message. I never meant for this to touch you, but I meant every word I wrote on those napkins. I don't know what to do, Gran, June admitted. Yes, you do. Arden stood, moving to her herb garden, where Miles Davis, the basil plant, swayed gently in the afternoon light. You just need to decide if you're going to write another letter no one will read or finally start living the story you're meant to tell. June watched her grandmother tend to her plants, seeing the strength and fragility in every movement. Time was precious, she realized, too precious to waste on fear. Gran, she said softly, I think I need to make a phone call. Arden smiled, not turning around. Use the porch, baby. The plants could use some good news. As June stepped outside, phone in hand, she thought about names and stories, about bravery and control, about all the letters she'd written to avoid living. Maybe it was time to write a different kind of story, one without an ending already decided, one brave enough to risk being read. Behind her, through the kitchen window, she could see Arden watching her with knowing eyes. June took a deep breath, found Silas's number, and pressed call. Because some stories, she realized, were worth being brave for. Ruby's coffee house looked different after hours, its windows dark except for a single light in the back. June stood on the sidewalk, watching her breath form clouds in the cool evening air. Silas had suggested meeting here, neutral ground that somehow wasn't neutral at all. Her phone buzzed. Back door's open. June walked around to the alley, where a simple metal door waited. No cameras, she noticed. No curious eyes. Just the honest darkness of a Chicago night. Inside, the coffee shop felt like a confessional, intimate, sacred, heavy with unspoken words. Silas stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, making coffee with the same careful attention she remembered. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights that matched her own. You came, he said softly, the words an echo of their movie date that felt like a lifetime ago. I did. June moved closer, noting how his hands paused, briefly in their work when she approached. Though I'm starting to think coffee might be your way of avoiding difficult conversations. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, more like creating space for them. He finished preparing 2 cups, then gestured to a small table in the corner. Shall we? They settled into the chairs, the familiar scent of perfectly brewed coffee wrapping around them like a shield against the world outside. June noticed Silas had made her coffee exactly as she liked it, even after everything. I met Regina, June said, deciding to start with the hardest truth. Silas's hand moved automatically to his father's ring. I know. She called to tell me. Called to warn you, you mean? June? No, she interrupted gently. Let me finish. She told me everything. About the photos after your father died. About why you disappeared from public life. June wrapped her hands around her warm cup. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, was that she was telling me about 2 different men. The CEO she wanted to expose, and the man who writes his heart on coffee shop napkins. Silas looked up, meeting her eyes. For the first time. Which one are you talking to now? That depends, June said. Which one is real? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Silas reached into his pocket, pulling out a napkin. Worn now, as if it had been unfolded and refolded, many times. June recognized her own handwriting. I found this, he said, smoothing it on the table. At Ruby's, the morning after you left the movie theater. June's breath caught. It was the note she'd scribbled while waiting for her coffee that day, words she'd never meant anyone to see. Maybe some silences are louder than words. Maybe some hearts speak in coffee stains and hidden truths. I'm both, Silas said quietly. The CEO who hides and the man who wants to be found. The person who built walls to protect himself and the one who writes on napkins because paper feels safer than promises. He turned his father's ring once, then stilled his hands. But with you, I'm just Silas, no cameras, no expectations, just me, trying to be brave enough to let someone see all of me again. June thought about her grandmother's words about naming your fears. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of the cameras or the reporters. I'm scared of letting myself need someone who might disappear. Like your mother did? She nodded, tears threatening. How did you? The way you hold yourself, Silas said softly. Like you're always ready to stand alone. The way you help everyone else heal but keep your own wounds wrapped tight. He reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of hers. I noticed everything about you, June, even the things you tried to hide. My grandmother's dying, June whispered, the words escaping before she could catch them. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. And I keep thinking, what's the point of letting people in if they're just going to leave? Silas's hand completed its journey, covering hers. His palm was warm from the coffee cup, solid and real. Maybe the point is that some people are worth the pain of losing. Maybe love isn't about who stays forever, but about who makes the temporary feel eternal. A sob caught in June's throat. When did you get so wise? Probably around the same time I started hiding in coffee shops, watching a night nurse organize sugar packets by color when she thought no one was looking. June laughed through her tears, turning her hand to lace her fingers with his. What do we do now? About the reporters, the cameras, all of it? We could run, Silas suggested, but his tone was different, lighter, almost teasing. I own coffee shops in every major city. We could disappear, become mysterious coffee shop owners in Seattle or Portland. Tempting, June smiled. But I have a better idea. I'm listening. We stop hiding. She squeezed his hand. Both of us. You from the world. Me from the possibility of loss. We face the cameras when we have to, disappear when we need to, and write our truths on whatever we have handy. Napkins, letters, coffee cups. It won't be easy, Silas warned. The media, they'll want a story, they'll dig into everything, your mother, my father, every quiet moment we try to keep for ourselves. So we give them a different story. June reached for a napkin, pulling a pen from her purse. One about two people who found each other in the spaces between words. About a CEO who makes coffee with the patience of a poet, and a nurse who writes letters to ghosts but is learning to talk to the living. Silas watched. As she wrote on the napkin, his eyes soft. And what's the ending of this story? That's the best part, June said, sliding the napkin toward him. We don't know yet. Silas read her words. Some stories are worth the risk of being unfinished. Outside, Chicago's night pressed against the windows, full of unseen cameras and untold stories. But in Ruby's quiet darkness, June and Silas created their own light. Two people choosing to be brave. One cup of coffee at a time. So, Silas said, reaching for another napkin. Should we start at the beginning? June smiled, feeling something in her chest unlock. No, she said. Let's start right here in the middle of our unfinished story. And as Silas began to write, his words flowing onto the napkin like promises, June thought about all the letters she'd written to her mother over the years. Maybe it was time to write a different kind of letter, not to explain an absence, but to celebrate a presence. Maybe some stories didn't need endings to be perfect. They just needed two people brave enough to keep turning the page. The hospital. Corridor felt different at dawn. When the night shift's exhaustion met the day shift's fresh energy, June stood at the nurse's station, finishing her charts while trying not to look at the magazine someone had left open on the counter, its glossy pages showing a photo of her and Silas leaving Ruby's coffee house the previous week. Chicago's Coffee King and His Night Nurse, a Modern Fairy Tale, the headline declared. June had refused to read the article, but she'd caught glimpses of phrases like whirlwind romance and mysterious past. Ellis? Dr. Chen's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Your grandmother's latest results are in. June's heart stopped. She'd pulled every string she could to get Arden transferred to Chicago Memorial, where June could monitor her care during her shifts. Now, following Chen into a quiet consultation room, she tried to prepare herself for what was coming. The treatment isn't working as well as we'd hoped, Chen said gently, spreading the scans on the desk between them. The tumor is growing more aggressively than we anticipated. June stared at the images, her medical training warring with her heart. How long? Weeks. Maybe a month. Chen's hand touched her shoulder briefly. I'm sorry, June. The world narrowed, to the sound of her own heartbeat. June nodded mechanically, thanked Chen, and somehow made it to the staff locker room before her legs gave out. She sat on a bench, phone clutched in her hand, and did what she'd been doing for the past 3 weeks. She called Silas. He answered on the first ring. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, they sat in what had become their spot, the small garden outside the hospital's cancer wing. Silas held her while she cried, his presence solid and unwavering. She wants to have a party, June said finally, wiping her eyes. Can you believe that? I tell her the treatment's not working, and she says she wants to throw a party. Silas's lips curved slightly. Sounds exactly like Arden. It did. In the 3 weeks since June and Silas had decided to stop hiding, Arden had embraced him like a long-lost grandson. She'd even named a new orchid after him. Because he's complicated. But worth the effort, she'd declared. She wants to have it at Ruby's, June continued. Says hospitals are for healing, but coffee shops are for living. Then that's what we'll do. Silas squeezed her hand. I'll close the shop for the evening, make it private. Just family and friends. Family. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. The media had been relentless in their pursuit of their story, digging up June's mother's abandonment, speculating about Silas's father's death. But somehow they'd weathered it together, creating quiet spaces in the chaos. The press will figure it out, June warned. They always do. Let them. Silas's voice was firm. Some stories deserve to be told, and Arden's is one of them. Later, that evening they sat with Arden in her hospital room, planning her party. She was propped up against pillows, her floral dress replaced by a hospital gown, but her eyes still sparkled with life. Now, don't you two go making this some sad affair, she instructed, watching as Silas took notes on, what else, a coffee shop napkin. I want music. Good music, mind you, not that wedding DJ nonsense, and my plants, they all need to be there. Even Gerald? June asked, smiling despite herself. Especially Gerald. That dramatic old fern needs to learn how to enjoy life. Arden reached for both their hands, pulling them closer. And I want you two to dance. Gran, no arguments, Junebug. I've watched you both learning to be brave. Now I want to see you be happy. She fixed Silas with a knowing look. You do know how to dance, don't you, Coffee King? Silas grinned. I've been known to manage a decent slow dance. Good. Arden settled back against her pillows, satisfied. Because my granddaughter deserves someone who knows when to lead and when to follow. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Time for medication. As June stood to leave for her shift, Arden called her back. "One more thing," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "I want you to read one of your letters at the party." June froze. "What?" "Not to your mother," Arden clarified. "A new one, about love and coffee shops and choosing to stay even when it's scary." She squeezed June's hand. "It's time to stop writing to ghosts, baby. Start writing to the living." Outside in the corridor, Silas pulled June close. "You okay?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm better with you here." His phone buzzed. Another business crisis demanding attention. He'd been juggling his company responsibilities with being by her side through Arden's decline, somehow managing to be present for both. "Go," June said, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "I've got 6 hours left on my shift anyway. Meet me at Ruby's after?" "Always." He kissed her softly, not caring about the nurses watching or the possibility of cameras. They'd learned that some moments were worth being captured. As June walked back to the emergency department, she thought about letters and legacies, about love that didn't hide from pain. She thought about how Arden had taught her that strength wasn't about standing alone, but about letting people stand with you. Her phone buzzed with a message from Silas. "Found an old record player for the party. Think Arden would approve of some Miles Davis?" June smiled, remembering her grandmother's basil plant namesake. "Only if we promise to dance to it." His response came quickly. "Deal. P.S. Don't organize the supply closet by color tonight. Save some organizing energy for party planning tomorrow." He knew her so well, knew she would seek control through order when everything felt chaotic. Just like she knew he would be turning his father's ring right now, thinking about legacy, and loss and love. Another message arrived. "I love you. Both the nurse who color codes her world, and the woman brave enough to let it get messy sometimes." June touched the screen, tracing the words. 3 weeks ago, those words would have terrified her. Now they felt like anchor points in a storm. "I love you too," she wrote back. "Both the CEO who hides behind coffee cups and the man brave enough to be seen." Outside her emergency department windows, Chicago's lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere in the city, reporters were probably writing about them, spinning their story into something that sold magazines. But the real story, June knew, was happening in quiet moments like these, in text messages and coffee shops, in hospital rooms and garden benches, in all the spaces where love was stronger than fear. She had a letter to write for Arden's party. Not about loss or abandonment, but about finding home in unexpected places. About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be loved, completely and imperfectly, in full view of the world. Time to make her grandmother proud. Ruby's coffee house had never looked more alive. Every surface held Arden's plants, their leaves dancing in the warm light of vintage Edison bulbs. Miles Davis played softly through the record player Silas had found while the scent of coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the air. June stood in the center of it all, watching her grandmother hold court from her favorite armchair, which they'd brought from her house for the occasion. "Now that," Arden declared, pointing to where Gerald the fern swayed near the window, "is what I call living. Even that dramatic old plant is feeling the music." She wore her favorite floral dress, its bright colors a defiant contrast to her pale skin, but her eyes sparkled with the same light that had guided June through every dark moment of her life. Around her, friends and family mingled, nurses from the hospital, neighbors who'd watched June grow up, even some of Silas's employees who'd fallen in love with Arden during her regular visits to Ruby's. "Everything okay?" Silas appeared at June's side, sliding an arm around her waist. He looked different tonight, more relaxed, his usual business attire replaced by a simple blue button-down that matched his eyes. "Perfect," June said, leaning into him. "Though I'm pretty sure I just saw my grandmother try to set up Dr. Chen with that new barista from the downtown location." Silas chuckled. "She did. Said something about how life's too short not to make connections." June watched as Arden gestured animatedly, telling what was probably another story about her plants. Despite everything, the cancer eating away at her, the medication dulling her pain, she remained utterly, defiantly herself. "It's time," Arden called out suddenly, her voice carrying over the music. "Junebug, bring that letter over here." June's hand tightened on the folded paper in her pocket. She'd written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find the right words for this moment. Silas squeezed her hand, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. The room quieted as June moved to stand beside her grandmother's chair. Outside, Chicago's evening pressed against the windows, but inside Ruby's they had created their own universe of warmth and light. "My grandmother," June began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "taught me that the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be loved. It took me years to understand what she meant. I spent so long writing letters to someone who left that I almost missed the people who were choosing to stay." She unfolded the paper, but she didn't need to read it. These words had been writing themselves in her heart for months. "Dear life," she continued, meeting Arden's eyes, "you have a funny way of teaching us lessons. You sent me a grandmother who talks to plants and believes in the healing power of perfectly brewed coffee. You gave me a career where I learned that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we can't see. And just when I thought I had built the perfect walls, you sent me a man who writes his heart on coffee shop napkins." Silas moved closer, his presence warm and solid behind her. "But your greatest lesson," June's voice softened, "came from watching my grandmother face every day with joy, even when those days grew shorter. She taught me that love isn't about who stays forever. It's about who makes the temporary feel eternal. It's about dancing to Miles Davis in coffee shops, naming plants after lost loved ones, and being brave enough to let your heart be seen." Arden's eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was radiant. "So this letter isn't about absence anymore. It's about presence, about choosing to fill the spaces between heartbeats with love instead of fear, about understanding that every cup of coffee, every shared silence, every moment we choose to stay, they're all little acts of revolution against loneliness." June turned, finding Silas's eyes in the crowd. "It's about a CEO who hides behind coffee cups, finding the courage to be seen, and a nurse who color-codes her world, learning to embrace the chaos of love. It's about all of us here tonight, choosing to celebrate life's beauty even when it hurts." She moved back to Arden's chair, kneeling beside it. "Most of all, it's about you, Gran. The woman who gave me roots when I was drifting, and wings when I was afraid to fly. Who taught me that every plant, every person, every love story needs patience and light to grow. And water," Arden interjected with a watery laugh. "Don't forget the water, baby." The room filled with gentle laughter, breaking the tension of the moment. Miles Davis shifted to a slower song, and Arden's eyes lit up with mischief. "Well?" she demanded. "Isn't anyone going to dance?" Silas stepped forward, extending his hand to June. "May I?" In the center of Ruby's coffee house, surrounded by Arden's plants and the people who had chosen to be their family, June and Silas began to dance. His hand was warm against her back, his movements sure as he guided her through the gentle sway of the music. "You know," he murmured, just for her ears, "your grandmother was right about one more thing." "What's that?" "Some love stories don't need endings. They just need people brave enough to keep beginning." June rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee and hope. Around them, other couples joined the dance. Dr. Chen with the young barista, old friends finding new connections, even two nurses who had been stealing glances at each other all night. From her chair, Arden watched it all, her smile bright enough to light up the Chicago night. Gerald the fern swayed beside her, its dramatic fronds casting shadows that looked almost like applause. Later, as the party wound down and the last guests said their goodbyes, June found herself back at the center of the room with Silas and Arden. "One last dance," Arden insisted, even though exhaustion lined her face. "For my two brave hearts." As they swayed to the final notes of the evening, June caught sight of a napkin on a nearby table. In Silas's familiar handwriting, it read, "Some silences are filled with more love than any words could hold." She smiled, thinking of all the letters she'd written, all the words she'd held back, all the love she'd been afraid to feel. Here, in this moment, with Arden's plant standing witness and Miles Davis playing softly in the background, she finally understood. Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we don't need to write down. Because some stories write themselves, in coffee stains and shared glances, in midnight conversations and morning silences, in all the spaces where love grows stronger than fear. And those stories, they never really end. They just keep beginning, one brave moment at a time. 1 year later, the morning light filtered through Ruby's windows, catching on the brass nameplate that read, Arden's Corner. The space had become a small garden oasis in the coffee shop, filled with thriving plants, including a stubbornly dramatic fern named Gerald, who had somehow outlived all expectations. June stood at the counter watching the early morning crowd filter in. She still worked night shifts at Chicago Memorial, but her morning ritual had changed. Now she spent an hour here before heading home, helping open the shop and writing in her journal, no longer letters to absence but stories of presence. "Your coffee, Mrs. Ward." Silas's voice carried a smile as he placed her cup on the counter. The simple gold band on his finger caught the light, matching the one on her own hand. "Thank you, Mr. Ward," she replied, accepting both the coffee and the quick kiss he offered. Their wedding 3 months ago had made headlines. Coffee King weds night nurse in secret garden ceremony. But the real story had been in the details the papers missed. Like how they'd gotten married in Arden's garden, among her beloved plants just 2 weeks after she'd passed. How they'd placed her empty chair in the front row surrounded by blooming flowers. How June had worn her grandmother's favorite floral dress, altered into a wedding gown that would have made Arden cry with joy. "The new location opens today," Silas said, joining her at their usual table. Each of Ward Coffee Enterprises' shops now featured an Arden's Corner, a living tribute that combined June's healthcare background with Silas's business acumen, offering both coffee and community support groups for those dealing with loss. "I know." June smiled, touching the journal in front of her. "I've been writing about it." "Still not letters?" "No." She opened the leather-bound book, his gift on their wedding day. Stories now, about life and love and coffee shops that become sanctuaries, about a grandmother who taught me that every ending holds the seeds of a new beginning. Silas reached across the table, taking her hand. On the wall behind them, a framed napkin displayed their wedding vows. Some love stories don't need forever. They just need today, tomorrow, and all the brave moments in between. The morning sun painted patterns across Ruby's floors, while outside, Chicago woke to another day of possibilities. In Arden's Corner, Gerald the fern swayed gently, as if dancing to music only he could hear. And June, surrounded by the legacy of love her grandmother had planted, finally understood. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let our story keep growing, one page, one cup of coffee, one moment at a time. Because in the end, it was never about avoiding loss. It was about choosing love anyway. And that choice, it made all the difference. In between coffees and silences, June had to choose between protecting herself or taking a chance on love, even though she knew she could get hurt again. In her place, would you choose to stay in the shadows, protected from the spotlight and possible disappointments? Or would you risk everything for a chance at true love? Think about how your past experiences would influence that decision. Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.